Making games is a complicated thing, and we see a lot of misinformation out there, so we want to clear some things up with 10 misconceptions you probably had about game developers. Keep in mind, we're not here to necessarily defend game developers, because, we do talk some shit sometimes, but we've listened to them and looked into how games are actually made to clear a few things up. Now, honestly, it's a miracle games are even made, and after this, you'll probably agree. So let's get started off with number 10. The first misconception is that indie games are easier to make than big budget titles. This is very often not the case. Just because a game has retro pixel art doesn't mean it's easier to build, and doesn't mean it just took one person in their spare time. Now, it can in certain instances, but usually an unassuming fun little indie game still actually has a team of people behind it to make it. Judging from what we've seen and according to interviews, making games is a grueling job that requires lots of effort no matter the size of the project. So while indie games might look really simple on the surface, it's really about what's underneath the hood that counts. Now, next at number 9, there is a belief that you need a programming background in order to be a great game developer. Now, I've seen lots of people in game development come and refute this, citing solely the fact that there are so many different aspects and avenues of game development and programming. It's only one part of it all. Making a game is a larger picture, and just because you aren't a master coder programmer doesn't mean you can't get involved in making games. Business majors, advertisers, artists, writers, and everything in between are sort of like individual little pieces that form a connected Voltron that is the final team and product behind a game. So if you want to make games but you're not a computer whiz or a math genius, don't fret. If you work hard, there may still be opportunities for you. Now, next at number 8, I see this one, and it's a weird one, especially after meeting some people who work on games. There's this misconception that everyone who works in the video game industry is rich. Average people tend to believe this because AAA development is so cash rich. I mean, games sell bananas, while development costs and budgets are higher than ever. You always hear about it. Plus, with, microtransactions and DLC and all that stuff, they're always looking for and pulling more money out of people. But really, it's like any other industry. The majority of folks working in it will make a modest, respectable living, but the few people on top will make more. That's not like an economic or political commentary or anything. It's just how it is. Because, look at it this way. On one hand, the Gears of War creator Cliffy B drives a Lamborghini, yet the guy that made the shoes your character wears in Elder Scrolls Online probably can just pay his bills and put his food on the table. So no, not everyone that makes games is a billionaire. They'd actually probably laugh at you if you said that. Now, next at number 7, there's the belief that if you're bad at playing games, you're gonna be bad at making them. We see this sometimes, and I think it's just people kind of looking for a reason to talk shit. As long as someone making a game has a full, deep understanding of video games, they don't have to be the masters of it, because with this one, honestly, it has more to do with the misconception that developers hang out and just play games all day. We've seen many developers publicly talk about the lack of time they actually have to play games because they're so busy working on their own, and even with that, they don't even have the time to play their own game that much. Now, that varies from studio to studio. Some developers do full playthroughs of their game during development, like the Zelda developers, but while in other places only certain key leaders have that luxury. It all depends, it's very specific. And at number 6, we have the misconception that DLC automatically means developers are purposely cutting the game into pieces. And honestly, it's not the case for every game. Now, this is a contentious one, I'll say that. It's a case-by-case basis, though, because there is some predatory shit out there. So I'll speak broadly, and I'll point out the good examples. While sometimes the concept of expansions and DLC and extra story content does kind of suck, most of the time it is not stuff cut from the original game just to be saved later on to make more money. The way it works scheduling-wise, large AAA studios finish games a bit of time in advance, so while the final version of the game goes to certification and to be put on discs and put in stores and all that, teams or groups in the studio often commence work on other stuff to add into the game. Now, whether or not you like that is one thing, but sometimes it's not stuff actually cut from the base game. Of course, this has nothing to do with loot boxes and all that stuff. That's a whole nother video. Now, down to number 5, there's this misconception that making indie games automatically means you have unlimited freedom. Ask many indie developers, and they will tell you the complete opposite of this. While big AAA developed games are bogged down by office politics, corporate meddling, and sometimes just being too big to put something cohesive together, indie developers are pretty restrained too, from a variety of different reasons. It could be a lack of skill in a certain area, technical limitations, or just not having enough funds for a certain engine or to hire enough people. With indie games, there's always going to be some general lack of resources somewhere that's going to restrict them, and they have to work around that, and that's really part of where the art comes from. It's not just about being unchained to do whatever you want, it's also about having the means to do so, and everything doesn't always line up that way. Now, at number 4, we've seen this misconception pop up a lot, and that's the idea that developers of casual games aren't actually real game developers. We kind of believe the opposite here. While some people think mobile games, no matter how good, aren't technically real games, I count them as real games, and I definitely think the people who make them are real developers for a very simple reason. Mobile games can have elements of fun. They're designed and built that way to be played and to have fun with, so to me, they're technically games, even if they're not the greatest. I consider game developers people who build fun from the ground up, and they're doing it with mobile games just as much as they would be with the next Grand Theft Auto. Doesn't make one less of a thing more than the other to me. And even so, consider the fact that maybe some mobile game developers are working their way towards more large-scale mainstream games. You never know. Everybody's situation is different. Now at number 3, there's the belief that without AAA publishers, there would be no games. Not the case at all. Especially in the last few years, the rise of Xbox Arcade and smaller indie hits on consoles and PC, the traditional publishing model isn't always the only solution anymore. Smaller games are publishing themselves, especially on PC, or they're just teaming up with smaller groups to get their games out there. Plus, Kickstarter-backed games have changed things too, allowing legends like Obsidian or Tim Schafer to be completely in control of distributing their own games on their own terms. And sometimes it's a much better thing. And there are many games out there that exist completely without a publisher in sight. Now at number 2, this is a big one that we see often, and in the past we've been guilty of saying this too. It's the concept that one man is responsible for everything in a game. You know, that game design in big studios is done by a single dude who is the single beacon of creative vision and who is never challenged. Well, it turns out this is pretty much not true. There may be a head of leadership in design and creative who maybe even gets a lot of publicity, but lots of people think someone like Todd Howard or a Cliffy B or even a Hideo Kojima has done and made every single decision themselves. Now, leadership is leadership, but large-scale projects are always a team endeavor. Games are much larger collaborative efforts. I mean, even George Lucas had help and insight and advice during the making of the original Star Wars. In fact, his wife saved the final cut of the film by making it that much better. Todd Howard may be technically God Howard, but he's not perfect, and he has other people help him, despite what many people make it seem. So keep that in mind next time. Now at number 1, one of the biggest misconceptions we see often is that game developers don't care about bugs. Every time someone posts a bug report or makes a joke or a meme about it or some sort of feedback, there's always the implication made like, oh my god, how did they miss this when making the game? They just don't care, do they? How could they? Well, believe it or not, they do care. Many developers have teams of QA testers hitting the games daily to weed out bugs. But usually, resources are always limited in some aspect, and it's never enough. Couple that with the fact that, think about this, before the game is released, a few hundred people were playing it and breaking it, and upon release, potentially hundreds of thousands are playing it and breaking it all at the same time. So there's a higher probability for everything. Like that with so many people playing at once, there's a greater chance that players will do weird things testers never did, like say move a certain amount in a certain millisecond in a certain place. Suddenly, once the game is for sale, thousands of hours are being played that developers couldn't get data on until it's out in the wild. And while they can fix things, it's likely never as easy as you think it is either. But for those that do a good job of squashing bugs or fixing things, we commend them. And honestly, that's what we wanted to do with this video. Game developers, game publishers aren't perfect, and we're gonna call them out. But we wanted to point out some little misconceptions here and there about making video games, and we hope maybe you learned a thing or two. If you did, clicking the like button helps us out and lets us know you maybe want to learn more about stuff about how games are made. And if you're new, subscribing is a good idea too, because we put out videos like this every single day. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.